Gary and Marshall Lee are the only queer male couple in Adventure Time, and I am in shambles over this. Like, think about how crazy that sounds. 283 episodes, 10 seasons and a spin-off, yet the only non-straight guys with a pulse are the ones who came out yesterday. Bubblegum and Marceline will always be iconic, but I think it's let's get a little too comfortable assuming that this level of open representation has always been there. So to anyone who says people were being too loud and hyped for Gary X Marshall Lee happening, please do me a favor and shut up. These two are everything, and represent a complex tradition of LGBT fanfiction. Because back in the day, the only way to make it happen was to do it yourself. These two also reflect the changing sensibilities of a world, where people don't have to settle for fantasy stand-ins to be seen on screen. So even if it's not the biggest or longest romance in the world, this couple is still important, and we need to talk about it.
Hyperion, my love!
Also, to be clear, these two were confirmed to be in love as well, making them the first and only other queer male couple in the franchise. They also killed each other and only showed up to immediately die again. Some will call that iconic, but I'm calling it barely relevant. So if we're talking male couples, Marshall and Gary are pretty much all we've got canonically. As the sad truth is, most of Adventure Time came out in a time before we could have anything openly non-hetero in any of our children's cartoons. This led to generations of kids being unable to see themselves on TV, which should be no surprise since the US laws criminalizing homosexuality weren't ruled unconstitutional till 2003. Violence against said community wasn't considered a hate crime till 2009, and banning gay marriage didn't become illegal till 2015. Shit sucked back then, a whole 8 years ago, and some people are really trying to undo all those gains. With this very recent context, it's not that surprising that there was just so little LGBT rep in our cartoons, as none of these companies wanted to lose money by making conservatives mad, triggering boycotts. So what we got instead was subtext. So much subtext and implications. Can't forget about the implications, and if we were lucky, the creators would come back years later and tell us that yes, those girls who were friends were in fact girlfriends, and we usually never saw them again. So with the very limited options, you can understand why LGBT youths would just turn to fanfiction to tell the stories that they couldn't find in their own media. This also led to a massive fandom for anime, as that was just, it had what the people wanted, even if what it was giving, not the best in hindsight. But some of the fanfiction was just for funsies and had no bearing on the actual shows. Others were about taking that subtext and just making it text. Fanfics were a source of passion, of fun, and in some ways, the only way to keep yourself sane, as constantly following the breadcrumbs of possible rep slowly drove people insane, as this was pre-Steven Universe. There was no guarantee that these shows were actually gonna pull the trigger and make a character's sexuality canon to the show. This is the context in which a lot of people experience Bubbleen, the seemingly romantic but sometimes rival but always passionate relationship between Princess Bubblegum and Marceline, two characters who are heavily implied to have some kind of intense past with one another, with everyone and their parents leaning in as it became very obvious that these two used to date. Now again, this was during a time of a frustratingly slow normalization process for LGBT rights in the mainstream. So while it was obvious, we never were sure if it was ever going to be explicitly shown, as it became very clear throughout the show's later season that the two of them had actually gone back together. I did a whole video on it, go ahead and watch that. But in the show, there was always this paper-thin aura of deniability, as really the show was just trying to avoid trouble, but this also ended up denying the viewers that full catharsis of that yes, they are in fact banging, with us not getting the full confirmation of them being in love till the finale of the show, where Bubbleen finally kissed. Though even this very satisfying moment for longtime viewers wasn't, like, it's shocking how this almost didn't happen. As if you didn't know, In the script for this episode, it only ever mentions them having a moment, with it ultimately being Hanneke Nystrom who had to push for it to be a kiss. Like, let that sink in. We were this close to being left hanging if not for a single storyboarder who pushed for the idea. This really just goes to show just how on thin ice all this representation was, with it requiring a push from people like Hannah and Rebecca Sugar, the architect of the ship, to get us anything. But we eventually slowly got it, and people have been reveling in these girls' love life ever since. Queer was queen, and finally everyone was being included.
My love!
Okay, almost everyone.
Spare change. Spare change, ma'am.
I know this is a lot of history, but kinda need to understand why Marshall and Gary matter as much as they do. But this was the fucked up compromise that a lot of LGBT rep had to make in cartoons. As for a myriad of reasons that I'm just going to label patriarchy and move on, queer women are viewed as being more palatable than queer men to the mainstream. The wrong kinds of people are throwing fits over all of it. But if the networks had a choice, they'll grumble about it, but they'll let queer women be the leads of a show. With this leaving queer men just being given scraps, with male couples also rarely popping off in popularity like their female counterparts do, which is its own can of worms that I'm not going to get into, and again force people to go to fanfiction to get what they wanted out of Adventure Time. But this fanfic boom, Bubbleen being canon, created an interesting situation for Adventure Time specifically, as in the wacky lore and shenanigans of the show, there was also the in-universe fanfic world of Fiona and Cake, a gender-bent AU seemingly created by the Ice King. This created a tantalizing prospect, as if Bubbleen was a thing, then that would mean that their gender-bent equivalents, Marshall Lee and Prince Gumball, would also be dating, which was as close as Adventure Time came to having a queer male couple that wasn't irrelevant. So people naturally obsessed over the unofficial pairing of the official fanfic. Shit was wild. But people had to cope somehow, especially since watching other shows well, people are lazy, so it wasn't an option. But this world of fanfic seemed where Gumball and Marshall Lee were kind of just destined to forever remain. Like so much of the LGBT rep that came before, it was stuck being a thought experiment we had to pick up the pieces for, with us reaching a tentative answer that, while cool, we would never get the full validation of it seeing the light of day. So people were forced to be content with fan creations to fill the void. But then, a very funny thing happened. We got a Fiona and Cake spin-off, then suddenly the impossible became very likely.
Who are you?
Who are you?
Now this is where my actual love for the ship comes in. If you stuck around this long for all the necessary backstory, you're the best. Subscribe if you haven't. But to me, Marshall and Gary in this show are a love letter to everything that came before and a celebration of where we are in the moment. As this show could have just been gender-bent Bubbleen, and people would have eaten it up either way. But what we got instead honors the unique space that this couple shared in fan spaces and just that desire to be seen. As for starters, we don't have to fucking guess if this is a love story or a friendship. On some level, Gary and Marshall do feel like a do-over for the hookup that we didn't get to see with Bubbleen. We got the moments of them growing closer, but then becoming a couple was something that happened off-screen, with us really just getting the aftermath. But now that it's more normalized, Fiona and Cake can indulge in showing these two dorks getting together in a way that we missed out on. We're introduced to both of them separately. It's hinted at the fact that these two, despite sharing a mutual friend in Fiona, haven't met yet. Then they meet half naked at her place, and it's pretty much game, set, and match. This show makes no attempt to hide or pretend that these two aren't gonna hook up, which is a comparative breath of fresh air with how evasive the original relationship was depicted. But more than that, the show also gets to lean into the idea of this world being a fanfic, and being a celebration of all those that were created, and especially a certain kind of fanfic. As while we all love to write a story that's just about the same world and the same characters, but there's always going to be something to be said about bringing said world closer to our own, creating a sense of novelty and proximity to the characters that we love to see living their own life in a familiar setting, with there always being a small element of living vicariously through said characters. How through them we got to imagine the life or relationship you might have wanted when you were 13 and confused. But rather than imagining some high-stakes game of vampire and royal exes, you just wanted to talk to that one cute boy from the bakery. Having a story set in a fantasy world isn't bad, but there's also something to that idea that we feel like we need to have these more fantastical elements to cover up what you actually want to see in your everyday. Like that time we made space lesbians into alien rocks who don't have biological gender, who would just so happen to all look like women. The history of early representation is a history of compromises, but Gary and Marshall represent a point where people don't have to accept them to see themselves represented on screen. These two are just two guys who think the other is cute, and that's all it needs to be. In taking a more slice of life approach, the show is able to lean into the cuddles with none of the personal trauma that haunted Bubbleline. From Marceline just watching the world burn and her double daddy issues, to PB growing up in the apocalypse and nearly getting lobotomized by her uncle's son, these girls were put through the ringer, but we're ultimately able to get through it and find happiness with each other. But for as much as we love writing stories about trauma, and I just indulge in all of it, we also have to remember that no one has to be traumatized to deserve happiness. You don't need to have these big declarative moments where you change your path in life. And I think that's a simple but beautiful angle that they took in Fiona and Cake. By bringing it closer to a slice of life story in a more realistic setting, Gary and Marshall get to deal with issues that are more relatable and relevant to its audience. From Gary's dreams of owning his own business, but getting bogged down in over-planning without ever really doing anything, meanwhile Marshall strains with a strained relationship with his mother, who is dismissive of his lifestyle and choices, wanting him under her thumb and working at the family business. These problems are comparatively so much smaller than anything Marceline or PB had to deal with, but that makes them no less important, as it's with each other that they're able to overcome their dilemma. From Marshall using his connections to spring a meeting with some investors for Gary's business, which doesn't go well.
I hate it!
But rather than being angry, Gary is finally freed from over-preparing, spinning his wheels and starting to actually try and make his business happen rather than constantly thinking about how he could make it happen. And he then turns around and returns that favor to Marshall by ignoring some new potential investors and going ahead to tell off Marshall's mom, who had leveraged Gary's need for access to capital by allowing Gary into her party, giving Marshall the Lemon Thoughts numbers. She did all this on the condition that Marshall give up on being a musician and come work for her. Marshall was about to throw away his future to help Gary get his dream job, only for Gary to say no and save Marshall instead, with the two of them ditching the party and kissing in the elevator. They ditched the toxic home life that was holding Marshall back, and allowing the both of them to start a new chapter in their lives together. This is a very simple story, but it embodies years of tropes baked into queer fanfiction. While being accepted by one's family is always the ideal, in the cases that you're not, the idea of telling off your shitty parents to create your own found family, to be embraced by this new community, is the basis for a lot of queer stories with a lot of fanfiction being tied to it. Those early writings from those who desperately were looking for an outlet. Fiona and Cake took those fan creations, the experience of all those who wanted to be seen on screen, and wrote a giant love letter to all of them. This story being in a mainstream cartoon couldn't have been possible 10 years ago, but here it is, more relatable than ever, with it being huge that's coming from Adventure Time's first major queer male couple. And to me, that is always why I enjoy it so much. Also, this bears at least mentioning. But the show was also given a chance to, well, rectify is a strong word, but to include various aspects that Adventure Time added in later that weren't immediately obvious at its start. For example, Marceline's mom is a woman of color, yet you would never have guessed that shit by looking at Marceline's design. I mean, the show's minimalist style does make guessing ethnicity kind of a crapshoot outside of who's voicing the character. Which, mind you, Marceline's voice actress Olivia Olson is also of Afro-Jamaican descent. But this lack of signifiers of Marceline's heritage led to the internet almost unanimously portraying her as a white woman or pale vampire in just most or all of the fan art, with those who actually give her African features being the exception, not the rule. Now, this is not to shame anyone who drew Marceline like their favorite anime girl, or did before we ever got a look at her mom in season 7. People didn't know. It is what it is. I can almost guarantee that this wasn't the initial idea when the designers first made her, as they were probably instead thinking about pool noodles. But now, here in Fiona and Cake, they were given a second chance to redesign Marshall, and there was a decision here to make him unambiguously black. Rather than his previous look that was, while pretty, has that Marceline problem where despite being voiced by Donald Glover, people still were going to draw him as just a generic pretty boy. So Fiona and Cake took the opportunity it was given to update Marshall's design design, so that just like his sexuality, it was impossible to get wrong. Again, I'm not damning Marceline or any of the crew for this, but if you're gonna redo the character, have his parents be people of color, be voiced by a person of color. Having Marshall visibly be a person of color is important, as it speaks to the growing move for inclusion and variety in the types of people we see depicted in media. Though if I'm gonna knock Marshall's design for anything, it's the hair. Marshall rocked the fuck out of the lock ponytail fade way too hard for them to backtrack and give us this more basic look. They showed us this first, and I was a little bit disappointed when we saw what he actually was gonna look like.
I mean, you're just so passionate. It's just impressive. To me.
Overall, Gary and Marshall are adorable. They represent the culmination of so many different ideas and threads to update and create love letter to the passionate LGBT and especially gay and bi fans who have supported this show for so long, to honor all the fanfics that have been made, from the wholesome to the melodramatic, but showing through all of it that these two people will always be in each other's lives, and neither magic nor some asshole in a suit will ever change that, nor hide who they were. This couple is top tier, and people had every right to lose their shit over it.